You're under citizen's arrest for weaponized barbecue emissions. That's the moment 3 fake cops tried to zip tie me in my own backyard. I didn't fight back. Why? Because I'm the sheriff, and Karen's HOA security team just committed a felony. What followed wasn't just a neighborhood meltdown. It exposed a $45,000 fraud, illegal surveillance, and a power trip so delusional, even the judge called it a TED Talk for tyrants. The day had started like any other small town sheriff's Saturday. After 5 days of paperwork, patrols, and breaking up disputes over everything from barking dogs to feuding bird watchers, I finally had a moment to breathe. I'd marinated my ribs, prepped the grill, and even set out sweet tea for the neighbors. A couple of local kids rode their bikes past and waved. Peaceful, normal. Until the microphone screeched from across the street and Karen's nasal voice rang out like the second coming of doom. Attention residents of Valley Oak. The HOA block safety event is now in effect. All unauthorized activities must cease immediately. I looked over the fence and saw a full-blown stage set up near the cul-de-sac. Karen, dressed in what could only be described as tactical yoga, were complete with a utility belt that held a clipboard, whistle, and what I swear was a pepper spray bottle labeled Karen Mist, strutted around like she was commanding a paramilitary unit. Behind her were 3 dudes, Brad, Todd, and the third one I never remember, wearing shirts that read Valley Oak Tactical Team. I'd seen mall security with more training. They were standing near golf carts painted to look like SWAT vehicles, complete with flashing LED lights duct taped to the roof. I knew right away something stupid was coming, but I underestimated just how stupid. My grill, it seemed, had committed an unforgivable crime. According to Karen, the smoke had violated air quality thresholds as determined by the HOA's new clean living protocol. I laughed out loud. That didn't help. Karen marched over to my fence and screamed, "You've been warned before. Your smoke is affecting the designated safe breathing zone for our block event." I calmly informed her that I wasn't under her HA's jurisdiction, that my house was built a decade before Valley Oak existed, and I had the deed to prove it. She ignored every word. That's when it escalated. Karen pulled out her radio, yes, a full walkie-talkie, and said, "This is Unit Alpha. Suspect resisting compliance at Lot 12. Request backup. Prepare for detainment." I blinked, looked behind me wondering if maybe someone else was doing something wild. Nope. It was just me in my backyard, holding a spatula. 10 minutes later, the golf cart convoy rolled up. It had flashing lights, a siren that sounded like a dying goose, and Brad holding what appeared to be plastic handcuffs. He shouted, "Sir, step away from the meat and place your hands where we can see them." I wasn't sure if I should laugh or call the actual police, but considering I am the actual police, I opted for the former. I introduced myself politely, Sheriff Luke Myers. "You boys sure you want to continue this?" Brad hesitated. Todd muttered something about this being above his pay grade. But Karen snapped her fingers and shouted, "Do it. He's impersonating a law enforcement officer to avoid HOA accountability." And just like that, they moved in. Before I could even reach for my badge, Brad zip-tied my hands too tight, I might add, and walked me toward the driveway like he just apprehended a fugitive. I didn't resist. I didn't even raise my voice. Why? Because right on cue, my patrol car pulled around the corner. Inside were Deputy Maria and Deputy Rick, both wide-eyed, stunned as they saw their sheriff being frog-marched by 3 men in khaki shorts. Maria hit the sirens. Brad froze. Karen stepped forward like she was about to address the United Nations. "Officers, you're just in time. We're making a citizen's arrest of this individual who is a danger to neighborhood unity and air purity." Rick stepped out slowly, looked at me, then looked at the tactical team. "Karen," I said, "you might want to stop talking now." She didn't. Launched into a speech about community values, legal precedents she found on Reddit, and some nonsense about a local HOA being above county law. It was a masterclass in confident ignorance. By now, a crowd had formed. Phones were out. My ribs were burning on the grill. One neighbor whispered, "Oh my God, is this real?" Another said, "Is this one of those hidden camera pranks?" Rick gently stepped forward, removed the cuffs from my wrists, and handed them back to Brad. "You just detained the sheriff," he said flatly. Brad looked like he was going to faint. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down. "He's a threat to neighborhood peace. I don't care what badge he has." Then came the fatal mistake. Karen reached for her clipboard, rifled through papers, and handed me a citation. It read, Violation 5B, Weaponized Barbecue Emissions. I held it up for the crowd. Weaponized. What now? Maria coughed to hide a laugh. Rick didn't even try. He leaned against the cruiser, shaking his head. "We're going to need to have a serious conversation, Karen." But she wasn't done. "You'll be hearing from our legal team. You may be sheriff now, but HOA elections are coming." She pointed a finger dramatically, as if she was on a soap opera finale. That was the moment it became clear this wasn't just about me grilling ribs. Karen had declared war, and she was ready to bring in every fake badge, printed charter, and golf cart commando in her arsenal to take me down. Unfortunately for her, I had something more powerful than all of that, the law. And this time, I wasn't just flipping burgers. I was flipping the whole damn script. Brad and his band of weekend warriors shuffled awkwardly under the weight of their own stupidity, standing in the middle of my driveway as the neighborhood watched the sideshow spiral out of control. Karen was still puffed up like a peacock on parade, convinced she'd just neutralized a threat to her precious block party. Meanwhile, my deputies were doing everything short of bursting into laughter. Maria leaned against the cruiser with a hand over her mouth, pretending to write something down just so she didn't explode. Rick, on the other hand, gave Brad a long look that could have wilted steel. The zip ties had left marks on my wrists, but I wasn't angry. No, I was something far more dangerous to a person like Karen. I was amused. Karen wasn't done. Her clipboard was now a weapon of choice. She began flipping pages and loudly reciting random clauses from what she claimed was the HOA's Community Enforcement Code. Section 14, Article C states that residents shall not operate pollutive machinery, including grills, lawnmowers, or leaf blowers during official HOA events without prior clearance from the event's coordinator. She looked directly at me. "That's me, by the way." I nodded slowly and glanced at Rick, who was now openly filming her with his phone. "Good," I said. "Evidence." The absurdity didn't faze Karen. In fact, the attention seemed to fuel her. She turned to the growing crowd and shouted, "This man refuses to follow basic community guidelines. He's endangering our unity. He grilled chicken without registering the protein type with the HOA Health Subcommittee." That last sentence drew some laughs from the crowd, and even Brad gave her a side eye. She was unraveling in real time, and it was glorious. That's when I decided to end the circus. I took a step forward, reached into my back pocket, and pulled out my wallet. Slowly, deliberately, I held up my badge. "My name is Sheriff Luke Myers. I'm the elected law enforcement official of this county. You're not above the law, and detaining me on my own property under a fake code from a homemade binder, that's called unlawful detainment." I paused for effect, and the neighborhood went dead silent, which is a crime. Karen's eyes widened like she just realized she'd walked into an ambush of her own making. "You're bluffing," she snapped. "You're trying to intimidate me. I have the right to protect this neighborhood. The bylaws." "There are no bylaws that override county, state, or federal law," I said, stepping forward. "You can't impersonate police. You can't detain a citizen unless you're witnessing a felony in progress. And you certainly can't run a pretend security team out of your garage using HOA dues." The crowd started murmuring. Some neighbors began whispering to each other, others shaking their heads. One guy in the back muttered, "I knew my HOA fees weren't going to the playground upgrades." That's when I realized this wasn't just about today. This was a pattern. People had been living under Karen's thumb for too long, and her illusion of power was starting to crack. Karen saw it too. Her voice rose in panic. He's trying to discredit me. He's making this personal. He doesn't want me to clean up this community. Her eyes scanned the crowd, looking for someone, anyone to back her up. But the support was fading fast. Even Brad was slowly inching his way toward the golf cart, like he might just disappear if he sat very still. I turned to Rick. Deputy, please issue a cease and desist notice for impersonating law enforcement and unlawful detainment. Start gathering statements. We're opening a file. Karen gasped. You can't open a file on me. I'm not a criminal. I gave her a look. Yet, Rick moved toward her, calm but firm. Karen started backing up. You're harassing me. This is harassment. I'll file a grievance. She turned to her security crew. Aren't you going to do something? Brad scratched his head and replied, I think I left my taser. Flashlight. I think I'm going home. She was flailing. Her entire power structure, built on fear and fake regulations, was collapsing in real time. The audience had turned into witnesses. Some had even started recording. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to wave my badge around. The truth was finally loud enough. Later that day, I attended the HOA emergency meeting Karen had called to review my conduct. It was held at the clubhouse, a gaudy little building with beige walls and inspirational quotes framed in cheap plastic. Karen took her usual seat at the center, flanked by two board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She tapped the microphone and launched into another tirade about community standards, noncompliance, and dangerous grilling incidents. When she motioned for me to speak, I stood up with a single sheet of paper. This is my property deed, I said. It clearly shows my home was built in 1995. Your HOA was founded in 2004, which means you have no jurisdiction over me. 0. I walked up to the table and placed the paper in front of her. Your attempts to enforce anything on me are void. That's not my opinion. That's legal fact. Karen sputtered, well, maybe not your property, but your behavior. I interrupted. Let's talk about that. You authorized an illegal detainment. You've misused HOA funds to create an unauthorized security team. And based on what I've heard from neighbors, you've issued citations for everything from sidewalk chalk to birthday balloons, all without legal authority. One of the board members finally spoke up. Is that true, Karen? About the security budget? That's when a woman from the crowd stood up and raised her hand. I work in accounting. Last year, the HOA budget diverted $45,000 into a line item labeled Neighborhood Protection and Safety. That includes the golf carts, fake uniforms, radios, and weekly briefings at Brad's house, which, by the way, included catered meals and wine. Gasps filled the room. Karen looked like she'd just been smacked with a frozen fish. Those were operational costs, she shouted. And wine is good for heart health. The board member said, we're opening a full review of the budget. Effective immediately. Karen stood up. You can't do this. I'm the president. But it was too late. The room had turned. The power was gone. I walked outside with a sense of calm I hadn't felt all day. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the smell of charred ribs from my backyard. The sun was beginning to set. I passed a few neighbors on the way to my car. One of them clapped me on the back and said, we should have voted you in a long time ago. I laughed. I'm already the sheriff. That's enough paperwork for one life. But even as I left, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down. She'd tasted power and would come back swinging, more unhinged than ever. The next steps wouldn't be about a barbecue dispute. No, the next steps would peel back layers of corruption and crazy that ran much deeper than a block party. And I was ready, because she'd made one mistake that would haunt her from this day forward. She'd tried to arrest the wrong neighbor. For a few days, things got quiet in Valley Oak. Karen had gone underground, figuratively, not literally, though I wouldn't have been surprised if she was hiding in some HOA-funded panic room beneath Brad's garage. The once overly aggressive security patrols vanished. Golf carts stopped cruising the sidewalks like discount armored vehicles, and residents, for the first time in months, actually smiled at one another at the mailbox. It should have felt like a victory. But in my line of work, peace that comes too easily always means a storm's brewing right behind it. While Karen licked her wounds and schemed whatever nonsense came next, I went to work. Officially, it wasn't even an investigation yet, not on paper. But I'd seen enough in that budget revelation, and from the whispers I was now hearing around the community, to know there was more beneath the surface. People don't just wake up one day and start impersonating law enforcement unless they've spent a long time building a false kingdom to hide something real. So I started asking quiet questions. I visited a few homes in the neighborhood, folks I'd met before while responding to noise complaints or neighborly squabbles, and started collecting stories. What I heard made my blood boil. One woman, a retired school teacher, said Karen fined her for having a flagpole that exceeded HOA height restrictions. Never mind that the flag in question was her late husband's military banner, and the pole had been standing for over 20 years. Another resident admitted to paying 3 separate compliance penalties to avoid having his driveway repainted, each time with no receipt. He thought it was strange, but Karen always threatened legal action or property liens. And perhaps worst of all, a single mother with 2 kids shared that she had been issued an emergency noise violation for a birthday party, an offense that conveniently came with a resolution fee of $300, payable only in cash. Karen's clipboard wasn't just petty, it hid a paper trail of extortion. When a single mom handed me a $300 noise violation receipt, I realized this wasn't about grilling. It was a shakedown. None of this was legal. None of it traceable. And worst of all, most of the residents were too scared or confused to fight it. HOA rules, after all, are notoriously vague and overwhelming. People assumed Karen knew what she was doing, but the truth was, she knew exactly how to exploit the cracks between policy and actual law. And that's where I came in. A few nights later, I got a call from a young tech guy in the neighborhood, Jason. He'd been on the fence about getting involved until he noticed something odd. He had recently installed his own home surveillance system, and while testing some new software, he picked up an unfamiliar signal. A drone. It had been flying a grid pattern over several homes, including mine. Curious, I asked if he could track where it originated. Jason grinned and invited me over. What he showed me was chilling. The drone wasn't a toy. It had an onboard mic, GPS routing, and real-time streaming capabilities. Jason pulled up a folder of saved footage, and there it was, clear video of his backyard, followed by another clip where I was on my own porch having a call with one of our DEA contacts. The audio wasn't crystal clear, but the tech was enough to send alarm bells ringing in my head. That wasn't neighborhood watch behavior. That was surveillance, possibly illegal surveillance, conducted without consent or permit. I thanked Jason and asked him to save every file, every log, and every signal ping. Then I took the evidence to county legal. It didn't take long to confirm what I suspected. If Karen or her security team had operated that drone, she just crossed into federal territory. Intercepting or recording communications, especially law enforcement communications, without clearance. That was a felony. And suddenly, our little community drama had turned into something far more serious. I met with Internal Affairs the next morning and handed everything over. They were interested immediately, but they needed more, specifically, financial documentation that could tie the drone purchases and other HOA expenses directly to Karen's personal dealings. So I called in a favor from someone who had every HOA budget file, Julie, the board treasurer. She had kept her head down for years, intimidated by Karen. But when she heard about the drone, she didn't hesitate. We met at a local diner. She came with a flash drive and a look of quiet fury. I should have done this months ago, she whispered. But she always said if we crossed her, she'd ruin us. I have kids. I couldn't take the risk. I promised her protection. I promised she'd done the right thing. Then I slid the drive into my laptop and opened the folder. There were spreadsheets, payment histories, and emails. The HOA had authorized purchases for equipment labeled community beautification and neighborhood outreach tech. In reality, these were cover-ups for surveillance hardware, fake badge printing, even a line item called incident readiness training. Brad had apparently taken a 3-day tactical workshop, paid for with HOA money, complete with pictures of him posing next to a cardboard cutout labeled hostile grill operator. The paper trail was damning, and so was the email thread. Karen had sent messages to the board about needing to collect actionable intel on the sheriff before he uses his badge to retaliate against community standards. That was it. The thread that broke the whole thing open. With county legal and the district attorney now on board, we filed a motion to freeze all HOA activities pending investigation. A full audit was scheduled. We submitted a warrant for property search, specifically targeting the HOA office and Karen's residence. I was careful not to lead the raid myself, too much personal involvement. But I didn't stay far. I stood across the street as the real uniforms rolled in. Unmarked vehicles, forensics units, a drone task force team from the city. Karen stepped out in a pink bathrobe and slippers, mouth wide open, still holding a coffee mug that said "Boss Lady." She shouted something about trespassing and demanded they show her a permit. They did a full binder's worth, signed by a judge, stamped with federal authorization. She went pale as boxes were carried out. Files, hard drives, documents. Neighbors watched from their lawns like it was the 4th of July. People clapped. Someone yelled, "We love you, Sheriff," and handed me a breakfast taco. As the cuffs clicked, I smiled. Karen didn't know the patrol car rolling up wasn't her backup, it was my deputies. And they weren't here to save her. Even Brad, who had clearly defected under pressure, sat on his porch sipping lemonade and looking like he'd just escaped a cult. But this wasn't over. Not yet. The evidence would go to court, and Karen would get her chance to explain it all. But now the tables had turned. The sheriff she tried to embarrass was now the investigator holding every receipt, every email, every ounce of proof that her little empire was built on lies. And the best part? This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Because when someone tries to turn a community into their personal fief, it's not enough to take away their power. You have to show everyone exactly how they used it and how you took it back. The raid on the HOA office wasn't flashy. There were no battering rams, no shouts of go. Just calm, methodical precision, the type of operation that doesn't look exciting from the outside, but devastates the subject within. Karen had tried to block it, of course. She screamed from her porch that the search warrant was invalid, that it was community overreach, that her HOA was a sovereign body operating under municipal independence, a phrase she clearly picked up from an internet conspiracy forum. None of it mattered. The deputies and county investigators went about their work silently, collecting boxes of records, drives, receipts, and even the HOA's walkie-talkie logs, which, unsurprisingly, were filled with ridiculous code names like Operation Smoke Sniffer and Code Red, fence height. I watched from across the street, arms folded, face unreadable. I didn't want anyone mistaking satisfaction for smugness, but inside, I was a full-blown bonfire of vindication. The truth was unraveling, and the web Karen had spun over the community was collapsing thread by thread. A few board members arrived midway through the search, visibly shaken. One of them, a guy named Mark who had voted with Karen on almost everything in the past, quietly pulled me aside and said, "I didn't know it was this deep. I thought it was just strong leadership. She told us everything was legal." I looked at him without judgment and said, "Now you know. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again." The biggest surprise came when the investigators cracked open a locked closet labeled office storage. Inside, they found what could only be described as a low-budget war room. Maps of the neighborhood with pins and red string. A corkboard with photos of residents, some labeled with phrases like problematic, compliant, or, in my case, under surveillance. There were recorded meetings on tape, lists of strategic HOA targets, and even a mock draft for a new amendment that proposed creating an HOA curfew authority. Brad's name appeared several times on the documents, mostly next to bullet points labeled Enforcer Initiative and Tactical Escalation Training. It was bizarre and absurd, but also undeniably serious. These weren't just bad ideas. These were plans, coordinated ones. We also recovered footage from the HOA's incident drone, which Karen had affectionately nicknamed Skyhawk 1. One video showed it flying directly over a fenced backyard where a couple sunbathed privately. Another had audio from a couple arguing inside their home, recorded through a cracked window. The final straw was footage of a child's birthday party, with Karen narrating in the background like she was hosting a documentary, muttering criticisms about noise, unauthorized inflatable rentals, and sugar-based beverage violations. That clip alone resulted in the immediate suspension of Karen's remaining HOA powers. She was barred from attending meetings, issuing fines, or communicating with the board until legal review was complete. The following week, we held a community town hall, not just for residents of Valley Oak, but for the greater county. People packed the Civic Center, standing room only. News of the scandal had started to spread beyond our town lines, and media outlets were sniffing around for what they were already calling the HOA takeover case. I didn't relish the attention, but I knew the moment mattered. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about rebuilding trust and ensuring something like this never happened again. When I took the podium, I didn't open with a speech. I opened with an apology. I told them I was sorry I hadn't looked deeper sooner, that I'd assumed a neighborhood issue was beneath the level of law enforcement concern, and that I'd failed to see the pattern until I was forced to become a victim myself. Then I explained the investigation in clear, simple terms. The fake security team, the illegal detainment, surveillance programs, the financial fraud, the impersonation of officers, misuse of power. I laid it all out, not to humiliate Karen, but to hold the system accountable. Because if we only punish people, not the structures that let them thrive, we repeat the cycle. After my statement, several residents came forward to speak. An older couple talked about the time Karen fined them for hanging wind chimes that she claimed disrupted Zen acoustics. A teenage girl shared how her family was fined every time she parked her used Toyota in the driveway because it wasn't aesthetically uniform. A veteran stood up and explained how he'd been warned for having a wheelchair ramp installed without submitting a request for property alteration approval. A wheelchair ramp. Then billed a teenager $200 for parking a Toyota Corolla in a Mercedes-only driveway. When I read those citations aloud, the crowd didn't just gasp, they roared. Every story poured out like water behind a broken dam, and with each one, the crowd shifted, not just in sympathy, but in awakening. When Karen tried to attend, she was stopped at the door by a pair of deputies. She wore a blazer, sunglasses, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As the deputies turned her away, she shouted to the press cameras nearby, "This is a political hit job. The sheriff wants my seat on the HOA board." The cameras zoomed in. I didn't respond. Didn't need to. The legal wheels were turning fast now. The district attorney had reviewed the files and determined there were grounds for multiple charges: wiretapping, impersonation, fraud, misuse of community funds, and harassment. The HOA board had voted to freeze all operations and requested outside mediation to oversee a complete restructuring. Karen's assets were flagged for investigation, and a temporary manager was installed to replace her. For the first time in years, Valley Oak was being led by someone who didn't believe clipboards were weapons. I watched it all unfold with cautious optimism. I knew Karen wouldn't go down quietly, people like her rarely do. But I also knew the structure around her was gone. The paper-thin authority she'd wielded like a sword had been burned up in the light of public scrutiny and legal clarity. Still, there was one more thing I had to do. I went back to the HOA office after hours, not as sheriff, but as a neighbor. I walked through the empty halls, past the motivational posters, to Karen's corner desk, and into the community storage closet. There, in the corner, was the corkboard. I pulled out every photo, every pin, every string. I packed them in a box. Then I found Karen's HOA president nameplate and slipped it inside too. The illusion was over. The throne was empty. Back outside, I dropped the box in the back of my cruiser and drove it down to the county records office, where it would be added to the case files. As I pulled into my driveway that night, the smell of someone grilling caught my nose. I smiled. A neighbor waved from 2 houses down, flipping burgers over a flame. No sirens. No citations. Just peace. And for the first time in a long while, Valley Oak felt like a neighborhood again. The trial is scheduled just 3 weeks after the town hall, and Karen, true to her nature, chose to represent herself. She walked into the courtroom dressed like a cross between a corporate executive and a renegade podcast host, power blazer, oversized sunglasses, and a leather-bound binder labeled Freedom versus Tyranny, HOA edition. The judge raised an eyebrow before she even sat down. Courtroom proceedings are usually dry, procedural, filled with quiet objections and routine filings. But Karen turned hers into theater. She strutted up to the lectern, declared that she was being persecuted by an overreaching sheriff, and began reading from a printout of what appeared to be a Facebook comment thread about neighborhood governance. At one point, she even cited a TikTok creator as legal precedent. I watched from the gallery with a mixture of awe and secondhand embarrassment. Despite her wild performance, the case itself was no joke. The evidence was overwhelming: the drone footage, financial records, witness testimonies, and the recordings recovered from her so-called command center painted a clear picture. She hadn't just overstepped. She had bulldozed every legal boundary and then tried to redraw the lines to fit her own delusions of power. The prosecution laid it out cleanly, step by step, with digital exhibits, community impact statements, and a list of fake citations she had issued that nearly outnumbered the town's parking tickets for the entire year. The courtroom went silent when the birthday party surveillance video played, and Karen, oblivious, grinned like she was proud of her work. Karen, I'm a sovereign HOA president. You can't try me without the board's approval. Judge, ma'am, this isn't your HOA group chat. Sit down. The judge was patient, too patient, perhaps. He let her ramble during her defense, even when she tried to cross-examine a neighbor with questions like, would you say your lawn is a beacon of community shame? And is it true that you once painted your mailbox without prior approval? But by the third day, the patience ran out. The judge called a recess, looked Karen dead in the eye, and said, Miss Bellamy, this is a court of law, not your personal TED Talk for tyrants. That was the moment something in her cracked. She stopped arguing and just sat there, flipping through her binder like it might contain a secret code that could undo the mess. When the verdict came down, guilty on 6 charges, including impersonating law enforcement, illegal surveillance, and misuse of HOA funds, Karen didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply stood up and muttered, "This town doesn't deserve me." Then she asked if she could appeal to the federal HOA, which, as the judge reminded her, does not exist. The sentence wasn't jail time. That would have turned her into some kind of folk martyr in her own head. Instead, she was sentenced to 800 hours of community service under direct county supervision, a lifetime ban from holding any leadership position in a registered HOA, and mandatory financial restitution to the residents of Valley Oak. Ironically, her community service began with sorting mail and washing patrol vehicles at the county sheriff's department, which meant every Monday and Wednesday morning, Karen arrived in a neon vest, signed her time card, and then walked past me while I sipped coffee in the precinct break room. The first time it happened, we locked eyes. She sneered. I raised my mug in greeting. Neither of us spoke. It was poetic justice. She wasn't locked away or silenced. She was made visible, humbled, and returned to the same people she tried to dominate. And the best part? She had to do it all while following real rules, enforced by real authority, not the fantasy world she built on clipboards and paranoia. Back in Valley Oak, things started changing quickly. The temporary manager, a retired city clerk named Nina, was unanimously voted in as the new HOA president after Karen's expulsion was made permanent. Nina had no interest in drama or power. Her first act was to cancel every standing citation and refund any fines collected under Karen's administration that had no legal basis. Then she opened the books for all residents to review, implemented a monthly Q and AMP, a session, and invited local volunteers to help replant the neglected community garden. Within a month, the mood of the neighborhood had completely transformed. People who used to avoid one another were now chatting on porches, organizing actual block parties, and helping elderly residents with yard work without being threatened with violations for using the wrong shade of mulch. As for Brad, well, he got off light after cooperating fully with the investigation. He was given a reduced penalty and required to take a city-sponsored civics class. He now worked part-time at the community pool, where he greeted people at the entrance with a nervous smile and no longer wore a utility vest or pretended to be Delta Force. Todd and the other guy, whose name I still never learned, disappeared from the area entirely. One afternoon, as I grilled on my back patio, finally uninterrupted by walkie-talkies or fake citations, Nina stopped by with a homemade pie. She said it was a thank you from the board for helping restore order. I told her it was a team effort, and she laughed, saying, "Well, we wouldn't have had a team if you hadn't embarrassed Karen into a courtroom." A few days later, the neighborhood hosted an official community celebration, not just for the HOA's restart, but for the return of common sense. There was music, food trucks, and even a dunk tank. And in a stroke of irony I could never have predicted, someone had placed a cardboard cutout of Karen next to the dunk tank, holding a citation that read, "Excessive fun." Kids took turns throwing bean bags at it. No one seemed upset. It was just closure in the form of laughter. Toward the end of the night, I stood near the edge of the event, sipping sweet tea and watching the sunset. That's when I spotted her Karen in her orange vest, a trash picker in one hand and a bin bag in the other. She walked the sidewalk silently, picking up paper cups and candy wrappers. She passed me without a word, but her eyes flicked sideways just for a second. She was still bitter, still convinced she'd been wronged, but she wasn't dangerous anymore, just deflated. And that was enough. One of my deputies walked up beside me and asked, "Think she'll ever come back swinging?" I shook my head. She might try. But the difference now? This neighborhood knows the law. They know they have a voice, and they know not to give that voice away to someone with a megaphone and a fake badge. The music faded. Stars came out. And for the first time in a long while, Valley Oak felt like home again. Not just houses on a street, but people who'd come through something wild together and found their footing. And all it took was one HOA Karen trying to arrest the town sheriff to remind them who really runs a neighborhood, the people. Now Karen spends weekends scrubbing patrol cars in an orange vest while the rest of us grill in peace. The best part? Her new community service uniform matches her old HOA polo. Poetic justice smells like charcoal and freedom.